Everything's perfect.
This is 13 years ago.
This is 13 years ago.
Now you have your dream job with your dad.
Everything's perfect.
You know, it's hard to get onto BYU.
So hard.
And you're doing exactly what you love, and you're supposed to be happy and thrilled. You're married. You're living the dream. And then you have this Jungian dream saying, get out. And how do you get out? Like, once you're at BYU, it's hard to jump to other universities. You kind of cash that chip in. There aren't a lot of people going from BYU Idaho to other great university positions.
Right.
So, like, I imagine you felt trapped.
Well, what I did is I shut that down. Like, I was not going to face, like, it was sort of before I could get my usual thinking going again was when I had that realization. And so I created my own sort of apologist's interpretation. It was like, that can't possibly be what that means, right? Like, I'm going to come up with my own interpretation of this. I think what it's really saying is that the green is the true church, and that I need to be careful about idolatry. Like, I came up with this whole way of interpreting the dream, but I knew that I was lying to myself on some level. It was a really weird experience.
A couple of the things about that dream. One is that it just reminds me of Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream and Joseph Smith Jr.'s dream and Lehi's dream, you know, just the whole tree.
I hadn't thought of that.
Just we have dreams at the core of our earliest Mormon history.
Totally.
So, you know, for me, I forget my dreams. I mean, I have them, but I don't really, and they don't really shape me. So meeting somebody who's had a formative dream that really shapes them sort of makes real maybe a little bit more the origin stories of Mormonism. But also, what's curious to me about this dream, as a psychologist, you mentioned Carl Jung, and, you know, Jung and Freud both really like to interpret dreams. Thought that was really important. It sounds like you weren't consciously questioning the church. You weren't consciously having a faith crisis. You weren't like consciously empathizing with LGBT people. Like,
not at all.
You weren't aware of any church history, you know, like struggling with church history problems. Just your subconscious is screaming out, saying there's something wrong. Ironically, when everything was perfect. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yes, it is. No, I just, and that's a very accurate capture of it. It was so confusing because of that. Everything outside of me was perfect.
Yeah. And
no, I had no doubts about the divine origins of the church. My testimony was rock solid. I 100% believed and practiced, and so the fact that something in me would point, right, as this darkness of depression was rising, as I was becoming unwell, that something deep inside pointed me to an unthinkable cause. Still kind of, I feel like that's really significant, that there's something in me, and I might say in us, that goes deeper than enculturation, indoctrination, sociality. The fact that there is something, whatever self is, that is that powerful and that would offer something like that is really compelling to me. And and
it's so interesting, whether it's a spirit or consciousness or just the complex brain, just this idea that some part of you is trying to communicate with another part of you, saying, hey, ego conscious, Ryan, something's not right. And that's not a therapist. That's not a parent. That's not a sibling. That's your own self trying to get through to you.
Right.
To say, you got to fix something. There's something wrong.
Yeah.
All's not well in Zion.
Right. Yeah.
That's so fascinating.
So, I would love to say that at that moment I had the courage to trust that and follow it, but I didn't. I shut it down as completely as I could.
And we do that to our peril.
Yeah. And that's exactly so. As I did, things got worse with my mental health.
And, sorry, I have to just say one more thing. And people get annoyed when I interrupt, but I have to make some connections. Think about the thousands and thousands of BYU Provo faculty, BYU staff, BYU Idaho faculty and staff, BYU Hawaii faculty and staff, and then all the church employees. This thing that we're talking about of like your soul crying out and saying there's something wrong, but you're trapped because your livelihood, your employment, your benefits, your insurance, your retirement is all tied to not listening to your inner self. I just have to make the point that you are representing literally thousands of people. And you hear this all the time about BYU employees, faculty, staff, church employees that no longer believe that are LGBT, or they have empathies with people who are leaving or people who are struggling, or just flat out don't believe anymore, and they're trapped. And that's what you're representing.
Yeah, it's a hard thing. And I kind of want to, so while there is this part of me that was pointing to a need for a change in regards to my relationship to the church, I also loved and continue to love.
Yeah, me too.
The church
Yeah.
with all my heart. Like it's not what I would hate for that to sound like, because I have many friends at many BYUs who are suffering. I would hate for it to sound like somehow they're being disingenuous by staying.
Oh, no. There's so many who love it. It's this double-edged sword.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people who are in all those positions who love it and it works for them.
Yeah.
It's just for those for whom it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So after I shut that dream down and what it was trying to get through to me, the depression got worse, and it got so bad that my mom started to notice something was wrong. And she said, maybe you should see someone. And I felt like a complete failure in that moment, because if I was really going to go to the world for help, because back then, I know that now there's a lot of positive talk in church culture around mental health and going to see psychologists, but that in 2008, 2009, that's not how people talked about it. It was very much a sign of a lack of faith to need secular help for spiritual problems, right? And so I felt that failure keenly as my mom very gently invited me to consider seeing someone. And the first one that I went to was actually a BYU Idaho approved counselor. And I figured that would be safe, right? And so I went to him, and he basically, with me, he kind of played bishop, and he gave me a talk from a general authority that, the Boy K. Packer talk about, just change the thoughts on the stage. And if you change the thoughts on the stage, then everything will be fine. And to me, that was like, oh, I can do this with obedience still, right? To someone dealing with scrupulous thinking, it's like, I can still beat this thing by being obedient, only now I'm going to be obedient to this talk. And for 2 weeks, it actually worked amazingly well.
At first.
Yeah. And I went, oh my gosh, maybe I'm not lost. Maybe I'm not beyond the saving power of the Savior and his atonement. Maybe I can find some kind of healing this way. But then after 2 weeks, it was like Pandora's box opened. It was like, you can only push that stuff down for so long. And so in retrospect, that first therapist that I met with, what he practiced with me was like a pseudo cognitive behavioral therapy, but not, because later I would meet with a therapist who really was an expert in CBT and who really did help me a lot. But that particular version, it really hurt me, and it sent me into a depressive spiral that was really scary.
What's hurtful about that approach? The turn it off approach, just suppress it,
right? What
change your thoughts, fight your thoughts, fight your feelings.
I mean, what was hurtful about it for me, in retrospect, is that was actually an act of violence. towards myself rather than caring for these things that were coming up, rather than offering them my attention, rather than taking them seriously and listening to them. I was attacking them. I was trying to kill them, right? I wanted them gone. And so, and that wasn't just an act of neglect. It was a violent act. And it was supported by a lot of ideological thinking that I had learned, the glorifying sacrifice and right, that the root of all evil is selfishness, and that you should kill the self in order to become selfless. There's a way of understanding that can be empowering and beautiful, but the way that I was understanding it at the time was incredibly harmful, and it felt like an act of violence. This is all in retrospect, right? At the time, I had no idea why. I was confused and terrified. But looking back now, I think that's what it was. I was attacking myself, deep self, whatever. I don't know what to call that, but that deep thing needs to be honored, and you have to,
And as someone who has a PhD in psychology and who has studied in depth anxiety disorders and depression, literally the worst thing you can do if you want to get rid of a thought is to try not to have the thought, to pack it down, to avoid it, to push it away, to try and think of other things to avoid the thought. Because mathematically, scientifically, what you do is you literally multiply the frequency and the probability that you're going to keep having the thought, and you amplify the power of the thought and the feeling. And so all those things you said, plus it's just bad. It's bad psychology. It's bad mental health. Again, try not to have a thought, and you'll have it 100 times in a minute. I literally in retreats tell people not to think about the pink elephant, and then they count in 30 seconds and they think about it 50 times. Mm-hmm. And this is just where religion and folk wisdom don't match with mental health. This is why we need therapists and psychologists and mental health professionals, because some of these anxiety disorders are heavily worsened when they're treated with religion, frankly.
Yeah. That's definitely my experience.
Yeah.
And so then when things started getting worse after that 2-week period of winning, that's when I really, that was crossing over to believing there really is something wrong with me. There really, I must be horrible. There must be essentially something wrong with me. And so that's when the toxic shame became complete in my mind. And
by this point, you have how many kids?
At this point, I have 2 of our 3 kids.
Okay.
Yep. And so again, it was actually my mom who saw this going on in me. And I remember saying to her, nobody understands how much darkness there is inside me. Like, I was convinced that I was that bad of a person, that lost. And so she actually invited me to consider seeing another therapist in Rexburg who, and this will reveal maybe the depth of my orthodoxy and patriarchy at the time, but I remember being concerned. If it didn't work to go to a priesthood-holding man therapist, why would it? This other therapist was a woman who was not LDS. So it was like, she doesn't even know the truth. How could she possibly help me? And so I went to her, and in our first session together, after 90 minutes of talking, she did these longer first sessions, and she just looked at me and she said, "I've got your ticket. I know how to help you." And we started talking about things, and at first we talked about medication, and this is not, and I know that medication has been tremendously helpful to so many people. So This is just my story. That's all. But I said to her, I want to just try if we can. I feel like I learned this somehow. I'd like to unlearn it if I can. This, what I'm experiencing, and so she said, well, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to exercise every day for this amount of time. And if you do that, we'll go from there and see. And so basically my sessions with her were a combination of taking care of my body and exercising again. And like real CBT, like really learning to recognize cognitive distortions, to catch thoughts as they come, to let them be there completely, but to see if they were accurate representations of what was going on in my world.
And CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, and it is a great form of treatment for anxiety and depression. It's empirically supported, evidence-based.
Okay.
It's a solid standard treatment for what you're experiencing.
Cool. So right after that first session with her, the next day we flew to my cousin's wedding, which was on Vashon Island, just off the coast of Washington. And that was the first place where I started exercising specifically as a part of a treatment for my depression. And I mean, I didn't even own running shoes. I went running in jeans and my BYU Idaho dress shoes, and the locals were looking at me pretty funny. But I had this really powerful experience where when I first started jogging, the thoughts, right before that, I remember getting to the bed and breakfast and just pacing and wringing out my hands, and I couldn't stop. Like I was in a really bad place. And I started jogging. And at first the thoughts in my head, which had become so destructive and very much about my worthlessness, and they got so loud, I thought I could almost hear them. And I'm jogging, and as I came around the bend on the island, I saw this tree that just stood out to me. And the top, about 4/5 of the way up the tree, there was this scarred section of the tree. And it stopped me in my tracks because I thought it was so beautiful. And as I looked at it, I realized, and I'm looking at the scarred section of the tree, that the tree wasn't beautiful in spite of the scarring, but that the scarring itself was actually part of what made the tree so beautiful to me. And that, in that moment, was like when I had my first glimmer of hope in years. And because of that tree, which is really, anyways, I think really important to me.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And if you don't mind, there's a paragraph in the outline you put together that talks about how you had read the scriptures and doctrine prior, that I'd love you to kind of talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Abraham and Isaac and Cain and Abel. Basically, religion teaches this kind of purity model where you're beautiful if you're pure, you're whole and you're clean if you're pure. And then if you make mistakes, then you're sustained and there's a blemish and it's dark. And just talk a bit. And now that you reached some insight, it's probably not chronological to go back and talk about your interpretations of Mormon scripture and doctrine that weren't helpful, but let's do that anyway.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So before I started getting help with my depression from a professional, and I was turning to the scriptures for help, the things that I saw there that impacted me is that, I read about Nephi, and he says, "Oh, wretched man that I am," right? Mm-hmm. And he was often held up as a spiritual example because of his humility, because he saw his wretchedness. And so that reinforced to me this idea that I should see myself as wretched. Let's see what else I wrote here. So, and that I also had a lot of leaders that taught me that the only way to fully access the power of the healing power of the atonement was a complete recognition of my own brokenness before God, to recognize that I was less than the dust of the earth, to recognize those things. And I even had a bishop very specifically instruct me to take more time to feel badly about the things I had done wrong. and this was in my adult life. And so I started seeking for reasons to feel badly, hoping that I could feel bad enough to qualify myself for some kind of healing. And so I ended up trying to sacrifice myself in exchange for healing. And my experience of...
And you had metaphors. You mentioned Cain and Abel, Abraham and Isaac,
Yeah.
Joseph Smith, Christ in Gethsemane. Talk about, I mean, it sounds like the core problem was you weren't listening to yourself. But every story in Scripture was basically saying, sacrifice yourself, ignore the self, kill the self, put the self down.
Yeah.
Seems like you were stuck in sort of a doctrinal...
Absolutely. That's exactly where I was.
Catch-22.
Yep. All of those examples, right? So, I mean, even the sacrament, while I fully recognize that communion can be a beautiful healing experience for so many people, for me, it was a reinforcing of this idea, that sacrifice is what produces healing, and that what I was supposed to put on the altar, just like Abraham put Isaac on the altar, right, was myself, right? My heart, a broken heart.
And a contrite spirit.
Yeah. And so, and the way that I experienced that, is that all those stories around sacrifice kept me going down this really harmful path with regards to how I viewed myself and how I treated myself internally, because I was literally trying to die so that I could be born again. I mean, that's even the symbolism of baptism, right? It's death of the natural man and the birth of the spiritual. All of those things played into the way I tried to approach my illness, which was, rather than approaching it with compassion, was to try and sacrifice it. And that was very much my experience.
Yeah. So hard.
Yeah. Yes, it was.
When what you needed to do was listen to yourself. That was what you needed. You needed to hear what your soul, what your spirit, what your brain was telling you. But all the time, the messages you hear religiously are sacrifice yourself, ignore yourself, be selfless. Mm-hmm. And that's what leads sometimes to people wanting to die, is they want to kill the self because they can't, because the self is the problem, when really the self is often the answer.
Right. Absolutely. That was very true to my experience. So, yeah. So I did start. So after seeing that tree and kind of having our third child was born, and in the meantime, I had gotten a 2-year sabbatical to go do my doctoral studies at the New England Conservatory in Boston, which was a stipulation for my tenure. I had to complete a doctorate to get tenure at BYU Idaho, which they call continuing faculty status. And again, just amazing support from people. But I started to heal. I just wanted to, one of the things that blew me away about this experience of needing to go on sabbatical is this was 2008 when I put in for it, which is when the financial crash happened, and the church put a hiring freeze on everything, and a member of the church who, Newell Daly, who is one of my dearest mentors, he volunteered to serve a mission and come teach trumpet at BYU Idaho so that I could go do that. And I don't even know what to do with that kind of generosity. But I know that his faith inspires that, and I love him for it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we went to Boston as I started to heal, and once we got there, it was like something really deep inside me just knew that we were far enough away from the bubble to really have some real healing happen. And so the depression resurfaced, and aggressively. And it was really, really, really scary time. Really scary time.
One quick thing, we think of depression as something we need to beat back and push down and fix and cure ourselves from. If you've seen the movie Inside Out, depression has a psychological function, which is it's basically yourself trying to communicate with yourself. So the last thing you need to do is beat it back, you need to listen to it. And it's just so interesting that once you felt safe, like you're outside the bubble, the depression rages because it's basically saying, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. Maybe now you're in a place outside of Rexburg where you can listen. And so it's throbbing even more.
Yep.
Once maybe we're almost personifying it as if it's a thing, but it's basically saying, maybe now you'll listen.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's why it gets worse, but really it's getting louder so you'll listen.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, right, and none of this was conscious. Like I was just terrified and confused at the time as to why it was coming back so aggressively. And that's when it started crossing over into suicidality, and it got really scary because I felt like I didn't have. So the solution of suicide was presented to me. I wasn't thinking about it or considering it. It was like my brain, when it realized I was ignoring the depression again, that I wasn't listening to the message of it. Then it offered suicide, and every time I would close my eyes, when it was really bad, every time I closed my eyes, my mind would flash really explicit images of me taking my own life to me. And so I was scared to close my eyes. I was scared to sleep. I was scared to, it was just a really scary thing. And so it kept intensifying until kind of the apex of all of this was I was walking home from the train. This was our first year in Boston still. I was walking home from the train, and I got and there was a park that I walked through every day when I came home. And as I was kind of passing the threshold from the park into my neighborhood, like so many, like the cruel thoughts were just yelling, and the suicidality was flashing, and intermixed with all of this was me seeing my kids in my mind's eye. And this was all just churning inside of me and kind of escalating. And to the point where, as I was walking past some of these houses, I actually thought that I saw like shadow something coming out of the houses to attack me, kind of like the movie Ghost or something. And then something deep inside just thought, wait a minute, this isn't real. I'm hallucinating this. And with me considering suicide on one hand and seeing the faces of my children and my wife on the other, I had this realization that if I continued in the church the way I had been, that I would end up dying. And so, and all of this is happening so quickly, right? It's hard to parse it out. But once I realized that, I said my last verbal prayer that I've said I've prayed with other people, but just my own personal out loud prayer is the last one I've offered. And it was in 2009 or 10. And I just looked up at heaven, and the first thing I did at the sky, and I said, Heavenly Father, I'm so sorry I failed. Like I literally felt in all of me that I had failed my mortal probation, basically, right? That I had failed the test. So I just said, I'm so sorry that I failed. And then like a switch, it just shifted from all the chaos and all the everything to just this quiet resolve. And I said, but I think my kids need a dad. And then I swore at God. It's the first time in my life that I said the F word, and it was to God. I mean, that's I never swore, right? And there was something, so I just looked up and I said, fuck you, God. and it just all went away. Just like boom. It was like this awakening moment. And sorry for the language there.
What did that mean to you at the time?
At the time, well, and so looking back at it now, I think it was two things. One is that using the F word, right? Having never spoken it before, it was so taboo. And I think there was something about the fact that it was taboo that gave it kind of psychological power, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is that that's the first time in my life that I addressed God as God and not as Father. And I think that there was something really significant about the fact that something deep inside me stripped him of that title at that moment. Because it was like how I had kids. I could not possibly imagine myself on purpose putting one of my children through this. Like, I was fine with theories around a fallen world and the things that, but the idea that a God with the capacity to, that a father would do this to a child, I think that was really significant that title shifted. So that's what I think it meant to me. But at the time also, I literally thought I was saying goodbye to all of it. To the church, to faith of any kind, I was ready to just drop it all and figure something else out. Keep in mind, I'm on sabbatical for BYU Idaho and about to have to go back, right? So,
it seems like it's a moment of empowerment. It's a moment of kind of downgrading God's status and upgrading your own status. It's basically saying this model isn't working for me anymore and I'm taking my power back. Mm-hmm. It seems like that's at least part of what was going on.
For sure. And I had another, like in this moment, once I said it and it all goes away, I had another experience with a tree where I'd looked and I saw, and it was like everything in my mind stopped after that moment. Like it just went quiet finally. And I saw this tree there, which I'd walked past dozens of times. And it was like seeing a tree for the first time in my life. It was, except before where I would walk around and see things and I would map their beauty and usefulness to my worldview, right? This has meaning because God created it. Now I looked at the tree and it was whole, all by itself. Independent. It was connected to everything and separate and beautiful. And it was like I was seeing this without labels, without dogma, without beliefs, I was just really seeing it for the first time. And it felt like touching reality momentarily, right? Just a glimpse of, that's what it felt like. I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but it was a really profound experience, and it shifted the way I saw my kids after that.
In what way?
Instead of the purpose of my child, so until that time, the way I saw my role as father was to ingrain obedience in my children, obedience to the proper authorities who could offer them life and salvation. Once I had that experience with the tree, now the purpose of my parenting was to see them as whole, already whole, and to nurture that. And to join them side by side in a discovery where I still am mentoring and passing on the lessons that I have to pass on, but recognizing that it wasn't about obedience. It was about life and wholeness and the imperfection of it all. And so because I had that glimpse of the tree, I was able to shift how I looked at my own kids to where I was no longer mapping their usefulness onto the way I saw the world, but rather was wanting to discover alongside them what was in them.
We read in the scriptures Jesus talking about being born again, and for those of you who are raised near evangelicals, there's this idea of a born again experience. I I've liked, and often I do this with retreats and workshops and in my coaching, take back that idea and apply it to a situation like this. It almost seems like you were born again, like you were born into a sense of your own power, moving the locus of control to an external source of power and authority to your own, and then kind of seeing yourself and the world and your children with brand new eyes. It really is a born again experience, I think.
Yeah, I think that's an apt metaphor.
Yeah. And it can transform everything: your marriage, your parenting, and your own mental health.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a listener, Gayla, who writes something somber. She writes, "What a poignant story. I have a family member who did commit suicide at that juncture." So I mean, and we're so sorry, Gail. And I've heard that in the mental health community, we're changing the way we talk about it to death by suicide.
Okay.
And not to stigmatize anyone. I'm just trying to educate myself about how to talk about things in a bit more sensitive way, because we don't want to ever blame or shame anyone for reaching that point. But Gayla is basically acknowledging and putting voice to so many people who either, don't make it through that hard time or die inside, which can be just as bad. And what I love about your story is that you're hopefully giving people hope that if they can find a way to listen, maybe they can not follow kind of down that same dark path.
Yeah.
So thank you. And love to you, Gayla, and to anyone who's experienced a loved one dying by suicide. It just shouldn't happen, and it happens way too much in the Mormon context, in the human context. But we know that Utah apparently leads the nation in all sorts of different categories of death by suicide. And so it's something we just need to keep talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, my heart goes out to you, Gayla. That's so sad. Yeah, and I just feel lucky, I guess. I don't chalk it up into much other than that. But yeah, it's way too big of a problem, and that question, right, as my story unfolds, what strikes me, I spent dozens and dozens of hours writing this over the summer, because just processing it. And what strikes me is how much of my story is so far mapping itself to the dream that I had that day. Right, that awakening of the self. If we go back to the dream, I think of the brother figure in my dream that way. That's the true self. Was actually me. That got so close to the edge. And it feels so far away. Like now that I'm in a healthy place, it's hard to even remember. I literally can't remember what it was like to be in that place. But when it's happening, it's definitely not something that someone is choosing. And it's not, I just think that's really important to say. You really aren't making a choice things are out of control. Just for the sake of empathy.
Yeah. Let's do this. Since Holly's going to be coming tomorrow.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your journey from that point forward, including your discoveries and everything.
Okay.
And all the way through to whatever point you want, independent of Holly. But let's allow Holly to tell her own story as the way we start tomorrow.
Okay.
So you don't need to feel compelled today to kind of reflect her story.
Okay.
We'll layer that on at the beginning of our interview tomorrow. Is that okay?
That sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll be great. So in that moment, so after that, right, we're still doing the school thing in Boston, and this kind of goes to the books part of the dream. This is where I started giving myself permission to ask questions I had never allowed myself to ask before. And those early doubts as a teenager, starting to explore some of those things. So the very first thing I did, and I remember this so clearly because I was so afraid to do it, because there was a lot of talking about don't go to the internet, don't go to the internet, don't go to the internet. But I did. I went to the internet and I typed into the search bar symptoms of being LDS, because it's the first time I allowed myself to wonder out loud to myself if the mental illness I was experiencing was somehow connected to my experience, to my personal experience of being LDS. And immediately clicked on the first link, a list of like 100 plus symptoms. I remember specifically that I had 96 of them. And then I looked off to the left and I saw this word that I'd never seen before, and it was polyandry. And I thought, oh, what's that? And I clicked on that and went down the proverbial rabbit hole at that moment with a lot of those things.
Tell our listeners what polyandry is for those who don't know.
So polyandry is when someone marries somebody else's spouse. So is that right? So in this case,
when a woman marries multiple men, is polyandry.
Oh,
I think. I think.
Yeah. I believe you.
Yeah.
So in this case, though, it was talking about Joseph Smith, who married other men's wives in addition to I knew that polygamy existed, but I had no idea about polyandry, and that kind of hit me for sure.
So basically, Joseph Smith married women. So he would seal himself and then have sexual relations with women who were already married to other men.
And that one blew my mind. And yeah, I don't necessarily want to go down the truth claims, but that was the beginning of me starting to untie I'll call it the perfectionist narrative of the church that I had inherited, because that is what hurt my mental health. The idea that, right, hearing stories growing up about, well, if there's one bad part in something, then it's all bad. And the really intense work to prevent us from talking about our problems as a community, the idea being that if we found flaws, that it would somehow make all of it bad. I internalized that in the way I saw myself. If there's one bad part of me, then I must be all bad. And so this was the beginning of me untying that perfectionist narrative around our origin. And it was really important for my healing for that reason. And I became obsessed with when I learned that death by suicide. Thank you for teaching me that. Then I learned that death by suicide was such a common problem in the LDS community. I became obsessed with finding a historical origin for that, because if it was just random, then it wouldn't be what it is. And so I really started going after finding a historical source for that. And I had learned growing up, right? I'd heard all sorts of stories about, general authorities telling their kids that it would be better if they came home in a pine box than without honor from their missions, and that it would be better to die than to dishonor the community. And scriptural phrases like "it would be better if you'd never been born" were often applied. And specifically, I remember one of my seminary teachers, because that particular scriptural phrase is about, could be read as somebody who hurts children, right? And Christ says it's better for a millstone for you to be hung around your neck and be better if you'd never been born, if I'm remembering right, which is totally possible that I'm not. But I had a seminary teacher frame that as it wasn't talking about actually harming children, it was talking about people who offend the apostles. And I believed that. And so the idea being, right, if you offend the church, which the apostles embody, then it'd be better if you'd never been born. So I had all those messages, and those quickly came to mind, but I felt like that wasn't actually enough. And so as I was researching, I finally got to the point where I was willing to look online, and I don't even know where this came from actually, but I realized that the one place I had not dared look was in a previous version of the temple ceremony. And so when I looked there to the pre-90 endowment ceremony, and I learned about blood oaths, and that my parents
Me.
You okay?
Yeah,
Did you go? Okay.
I did. Yeah.
So the idea
I served a mission in '88.
that you enacted your own suicide ritually as a symbol of your lack of worth if you didn't keep the covenants you made. That was such a central place, held such a central place in the sacred rituals of my faith community. It just bowled me over. And to me, that was my, there it is. This is why this is so palpable in our community as something that our minds offer to us in times of great distress, especially if that distress is related to somehow failing the community in terms of our faithfulness. And it broke my heart. It completely broke my heart. And so, yeah, next, I'll leave that to Holly to talk about tomorrow.
So how did that connect with, was there anything about Rexburg culture that?
Well, I mean, a lot of people had kind of, as I talked to some of my friends and colleagues at BYU Idaho, they would say, boy, that your experience is so different than mine. I think it's just because you grew up in Rexburg, which is the most conservative town, right, in
I call it Mormon. I call it Mormon Saudi Arabia.
Right. Yeah.
It's
really
Mormon Wahhabism, basically.
It can be really intense.
Sharia law.
So for a while I thought, oh, okay, well I must have just had this unusual experience because of where I grew up. But to discover that held such a central place in all of it, it made me sad. It made me angry that no one had spoken to this openly, that we weren't talking about it in a way that could bring healing. It was a whole wash of grief and everything that goes with that when I realized that. But it was also an important moment for me. And I also went to other books, right? It's, if you're willing to go into the forbidden section of the library, right? Which had been pretty much outlined by Boyd K. Packer, right? Feminist intellectuals and homosexuals. So I started daring to read those things. And this was really important to me because I needed... So I actually initially started reading a lot of like the new atheists, Daniel Dennett and Sam Hawkins and
Sam Harris,
thank you, and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. Yeah. So I read a lot of their books, and it was really important for me in terms of deconstructing literalism. Their goal is to deconstruct all of religion.
All belief. All churches.
I would gladly, that could be a whole nother podcast where I refute that. But the tools that they offered to deconstruct literalism were really valuable to me and helped me maintain certain boundaries as I continued my journey. However, they fell short in that it felt like the dogma of the new atheists felt very familiar to my taste buds, right? As it was still separating the world into us and them, the enlightened and the unenlightened, right? And so there was a period where those were helpful for me, and they were helpful for deconstructing literal thought, but they offered nothing by way of constructing, giving language to my experience of the self as I was now experiencing it. I don't know. Do you want me to go through some of these books at all?
The formative books. It's great. I want to include this book list in the podcast notes because there's just some phenomenal books here. So share some of the ones that were most influential. Okay. For sure.
Will do. So one really important book, which my therapist gave me, is called Healing the Shame That Binds You by John Bradshaw. And that one just really helped me understand the difference between toxic shame and guilt. And he also does a good job. It's not a particularly rigorous book in terms of academics, but there was a lot of really helpful information there for understanding the basics of how less healthy family systems can work. And it just gave me a lot of tools for that. So the drama of The Gifted Child by Alice Miller was incredibly important for me. Alice Miller was one of the earliest advocates for against child abuse and for believing the experiences of children. And when she says gifted child, she's not talking about children who are like gifted and talented in the way she's talking literally about children who had the gift of cutting themselves off from their true selves in order to satisfy the expectations of the people around them.
The gift as in sacrifice.
Yeah. And so it's a really it was the kind of book that I would read one paragraph and have to close it and come back to, because it was so much to internalize. But in the end, it was this tremendously powerful advocate for believing myself, is how that book helped me. There's a book called Resilience by Boris Cyrulnik, and that one just talks a lot about the power of one of the most powerful ways to tap into our resilience is to share our stories with what he and Alice Miller both call enlightened witnesses, people who will hear us and believe us, and that people who have experienced trauma, they need to find languages like the arts, actually, that allow them to express their experience in socially acceptable ways in order to tap into their own resilience and keep moving forward. It's really powerful. An Adult Child's Guide to What's Normal by John Friel. That was super helpful for me because it was like these just very specific scenarios that you're going to come across in life and what an unhealthy response would look like and some options for more healthy responses. And I needed that sort of nuts and bolts approach to becoming an adult. Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism was huge. I know you've talked about that a lot on the podcast.
Stephen Hassan, who we've had on, who's one of the cult world's experts in cults.
Yeah.
He basically looks to Robert Lifton as one of his main sources of inspiration for all his work that you mentioned later.
Yes.
Combating cult mind control, et cetera, is sort of a way to simplify and popularize the work of Robert Lifton.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so for me, if I think it's chapter 22, that was the really helpful one from the Lifton book for me. And again, like not to characterize, because the Steve Hassan book was also really important to me.
It's not useful to call any church a cult, right?
Well,
or be careful.
And just for me, it's like I'm totally open to the possibility that someone else has a non-cultic experience within the same organization.
Right.
Like I'm just saying this was my experience, and that is as far as I'm going with that. So another really important book for the kind of deconstruction phase was The Origin of Satan by Elaine Pagels. She's a brilliant religious historian, and she traces the evolution of the concept of Satan from early, from kind of when Greek culture meets Christianity and how that evolves and how it changes. And that was really important to me because I spent so much of my life feeling like I was being attacked by Satan. And so to see that a historian could demonstrate the evolution of that concept, it removed that power, the power of that ideation, I guess. Brene Brown, of course, everybody. It's been hell. And then one of the big ones for me was this book called Bounded Choice: True Believers in Charismatic Cults by Janja Lalich. Do you know that one? Have you stumbled across that?
I need to read it.
It's pretty fantastic. It was even more helpful for me than the Bite model because she's a sociologist, and there was something about the sociological perspective of looking at high demand groups that was really helpful for me. And her definition of bounded choice, which was also really helpful for me, is this concept she created where the idea is that if you're in a group that's unified by its allegiance to a charismatic leader, that there's this idea, what they're offering you is freedom, Right? Here's freedom in exchange for your complete and total obedience. So it's this dichotomy. That's why she calls it bounded choice. You're free to choose, right? But the only choice that will produce freedom and happiness is this one. And so that feeling stuck in that, it was a really, really, really important book for me. She just does a comparative study of Heaven's Gate and the Democratic Workers' Party, so a political organization and a more, I guess, spiritual-minded one. And it was just fascinating to read all the similarities in those experiences. So, and then, of course, I turned to a lot of podcasts. Mormon Stories was super helpful. Thank you.
What was important about podcasts?
Well, the podcasts, it was sort of, you're not alone, you're not crazy, right? Like, there's a lot of people experiencing this. I could go through a list of several of the Mormon Stories, episodes that had profound impact on me. Listening to Lindsay Hansen Park talk about dealing, like her journey into mental well-being, really powerful for me. Bent Washburn's episode, I think I've listened to that more times than I can count. And it was actually, he's the one that turned the corner for me to start really believing my LGBTQ friends, with humor, right? You get in the comfort of your own laughter and all of a sudden realize your worldview is shifting, and it's really beautiful and powerful. So I listened to every Mormon Stories podcast I get my hands on at that time. So that was 2010, I think. So
you used a term for therapy through reading.
Oh, when we were talking before. Yeah, bibliotherapy.
It's a real thing. Talk about that.
I just know that the more I read, the more information I had that allowed me to build a new kind of relationship with myself, and with the world around me, the more I was able to keep the boundaries in place for this experience of what I guess I would call my true self now. It was really helpful for me so all of these books were super important to having language to support my experience.
So we'll make sure and include a list of these books in the podcast notes, and just reiterate that that's one of the main reasons we do podcasts, that other people do podcasts, because people do get sometimes years worth of therapy through listening to podcasts and reading books, and it's just really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So helpful to me.
So I wonder. Tell me if you agree, but it seems like we're kind of 2 hours in, and it seems like this is the point where you're going to be going back to BYU Idaho, and then your wife is going to be having her struggles, and then you're going to have to be navigating. Let's like we talked about, let's save that for tomorrow. But is there anything else you want to tell about your story?
Yeah, I think just on the other side. So I've talked a lot about sources that help me deconstruct harmful things. So there were a lot of things that helped me build a healthy sense of self.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
And I just, another one of the podcasts that's been really useful for that is called On Being, which
Krista Tippett.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But she had a guest on named John O'Donohue, who's an Irish philosopher and poet. And he made this one statement in there, which was that psychology gives us tremendous tools for understanding illness and deconstructing unhealthy things, but that we need other language. We need other language to help build. And so in his view, he said that for that we need poets and mystics. And so I have turned to a lot of poetry, actually, to help me find language to give me an experience of myself that's more honest. And Joy Harjo, Mary Oliver, Walt Whitman. Anyways, maybe I could provide a list of poets who were just so important for me. Rumi. When I need to experience something beyond the duality of thought, I guess. That's where I go there, and also to music. And music's been a huge piece of my healing as well. But yeah, maybe we can talk about that tomorrow as we move forward.
So shout out to Kimberly Anderson. We're always glad you joined us, Kimberly. She writes, I love his understanding of various therapeutic modalities, both helpful and not helpful. He puts them into very accessible terms and language. Thank you, Ryan. This is an incredibly powerful interview. Hugs and kisses from Kimberly. Hey, Kimberly. Judy writes, how did you learn to trust what you read? In the church, we are warned of outside influences and the philosophies of men.
Yeah.
Especially reading the New Atheists and listening to podcasts like Mormon Stories, you're warned against that. How did you overcome that?
For me, it had to come to an emotional breaking point for me to be able to do that. For me, it wasn't, I know some people, their journey gets started by thoughts from outside of the approved thinking, but for me, it really was having that emotional crisis and realizing that something had to change. And so, yeah, that's the best I can do to answer that, I think.
That's great. Nicole Upchurch writes, Ryan has a way of embracing his deepest sadness and transforming it to help himself and others. He is a leader, even if not within the context of the church. As his patriarchal blessing implied, there's power in sharing our individual stories. Thank you, John, for having Ryan on your show.
That's my sister.
Hey, Nicole. Thanks for joining us.
She is an amazing singer, songwriter, banjoist. Anyways, yeah.
She's still in the church? Or you don't have to out her?
No, she's not.
Okay. Jack writes,
was the first one
go
to
ahead.
start that journey in our family, actually.
Oh, okay.
She's the leader.
A little bit of a pioneer in your family. Yeah. Jack writes, I survived growing up in Rexburg. Patricia writes, dreams can communicate with us when we are denied our own voice. And then Allie writes, thank you for sharing such painful moments. You're helping many who have experienced the same pain of suppressing true self and the resulting depression. So lots of people thanking you. So I don't want to stop. And I know listeners, we've got 133 people tuned in, but I just want to really get your wife in at this point because I think her part of the story is crucial. And then it really plays into what you're experiencing once you go back to BYU Idaho. So is this the right point? Is this the right point to stop?
I think this is a good, nice pause right here.
Okay. So. All right. So listeners, here's what we're going to do. We're going to end for now. And then we're going to bring Ryan back with his dear wife, Holly. Yeah. And we're going to talk about what happens with her faith and then how that impacts a professor at BYU Idaho when he's trying to survive and thrive and get his continuing endorsement to stay worthy to remain an employee. And unfortunate abuses that happened, ecclesiastical abuses to Ryan and his family. And then we'll also talk about what it's like to navigate BYU Idaho from the inside, to deal with executive leadership within a BYU, a church-owned school. This will give insight into the honor code debacles we've been having lately. And then we're going to talk about the struggles for BYU Idaho to comply with Title IX and issues around sexual abuse and sexual harassment, and sexual misconduct, particularly as it relates to the relationship between bishoprics and stake presidencies and BYU Idaho students and BYU Idaho staff and faculty. And I just think it's a really important and timely set of stories around that. So I'm sorry to have to end today, but it'll be worth it to bring Holly on and to tell the story from both their perspectives tomorrow. So we'll be coming right back at you tomorrow morning probably, and we'll get this done. Any final things you want to say just for this episode?
No, I think this is great. Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Kimberly says time for Crown Burger. That's right. It's time for lunch. It's time to eat. So
drive through Cranberger.
Yeah, drive through only. Kimberly Anderson. Do not go into any food establishment. Use hand sanitizer, and don't shake hands. Bump elbows. Keep 6 feet from other people. Don't be in crowds. Stay home as much as you can, and respect COVID-19. Respect the coronavirus, and let's get our missionaries home. Let's get our temple workers home. Let's get our desert industry workers home. Let's get our beehive clothing people home, patriarchs home. Let's do all we can in a time of crisis to get our Mormons healthy and well and safe from what's going on around us. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you guys again soon tomorrow. And again, thank you so much, Ryan, for your willingness to share such heartwarming stuff. We'll see you tomorrow. Heartwarming stuff.
Sounds good. See you tomorrow.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks.
All right. Take care, everybody.